Hey everybody, this is Vince Miller. Thank you so much for joining me today. Today the topic is the rise of pastoral narcissism. I think you'll love it. Now before we dive in, I want to encourage you to do something for me. If you're a guy and you're looking to grow in your faith, head over to my website. It's beresolute.org, beresolute.org. All kinds of great resources for you over there to help you grow in your faith. One of them is the Men's Daily Devotional. I want to encourage you to check that out. Daily, I write a short, sweet, to the point devotional that you can get in written, audio, or video formats. Just read the Bible along with me. I think it will really help to spur you on in your growth of faith. And with that, let's dive into our topic, the rise of pastoral narcissism. You know, over the last couple of decades, I think many of us have been surprised by how many pastors have had a devastating fall from glory. You know, when I was growing up, it seemed like, for the most part, the only controversies surrounding the pastorate were, some money practices, heresy, and from time to time, sexual improprieties. But over the last couple of decades, we have heard more and more about pastors who really failed to finish well. Rarely are we hearing stories anymore about religious leaders who actually do finish well, like Billy Graham. More often than not, we hear stories about men like Perry Noble or Mark Driscoll or Bill Hybels or Ravi Zacharias or James McDonald, Jerry Falwell Jr., and oh my goodness, there's more and more and more. These are stories of leaders who have done things like abused power, concealed addictions, embezzled money, engaged in socially unacceptable behavior, and been involved in sexually devious practices. In addition, there are also leaders who have been opponents of all these activities, which is just mind-blowing if you think about it. And I bet you can think of pastors in your local community who may be of a little bit of a lesser status and have done the same. And this is troubling to me, not only because it affects their witness and the truth taught from their lips, but because so many people are directly impacted by their sin. And sometimes these people are so wounded that they will never return to the church again. One of these people is actually my mother, who felt spiritual abuse actually kept her from ever walking back into a church again. Today, one of the words that we more commonly use to describe these pastors is narcissistic. And I will confess that I've actually used this word a few times to describe pastors I have encountered. And I do believe narcissism has made its way into the leadership of the church. Yet I also think it's essential to understand narcissism so that we're not weaponizing the word against people that actually may not be narcissistic. So what is narcissism? Let's deal with that first. Narcissism is actually a personality disorder. The term originated from a mythological story of a young man named Narcissus. And in mythology, he was this extraordinary, good-looking young man who fell in love with no one until he saw his reflection in the water. And then he fell in love with that himself. And thus we derive the name narcissism, which is defined as the extreme love of self. And in social science, there's actually a name for this disorder. It is uniquely called NPD, which stands for Narcissistic Personality Disorder. And 5 characteristics are common to a person with NPD. And here they are. Number 1, inflated self-importance. Number 2, a need for domination. Number 3, strained relationships. Number 4, a lack of empathy. And number 5, sensitivity to any kind of criticism. Now, before you jump to diagnosing someone you believe has NPD, I want to give you a few insights, 3 specifically. First, not every business owner, president, politician, or pastor you disagree with is a narcissist. In fact, someone, I think, can exhibit 1 to 2 of those characteristics without being clinically diagnosed with NPD. And I would guess that as you read those characteristics yourself, that there is at least one that you might have an issue with, maybe one that you struggle with. Now, I know that there's one item on that list that I struggle with, and actually it's empathy. I've always struggled with empathy because I have some childhood scars. However, I discovered that this was an issue for me. And instead of dismissing it, I've learned to empathize with others by connecting with their pain. So am I a narcissist? Well, I hope not, but I could become one if I continue to ignore it and if other characteristics on that list exhibit themselves in my life. This brings me to a second insight. The 5 characteristics we just mentioned are just simply sins. And guess what? Everyone is sinful. But this doesn't make everyone a narcissist. For example, some pastors on that initial list were just sinful and made some huge mistakes, but might not be clinically diagnosed with NPD. They might only exhibit a couple of characteristics of narcissism, actually in an attempt to hide their sin. A third insight is this, and I think this one's important. It does take some time to know whether or not someone has NPD, because people with full-blown clinical narcissism are really good at controlling the narrative and other people. They are masters at managing their environment, and this is why it is usually only a grotesque sin that finally exposes them. So now we got a definition, maybe some characteristics, and some good ground rules and insights. Let's actually discuss 2 important questions that I've been thinking about regarding this issue. And the questions are, number 1, how do pastors get this way? And number 2, how can we prevent it? So the first one, how do pastors become narcissistic? Now, this is a question that kind of bugs me, mostly because I can understand how, like, a dictator becomes a narcissist. But in my mind, a pastor should be the least selfish person on the face of the planet. And I find it odd that I don't hear a lot of discussion about how Christian leaders get this way. I mean, we do talk about all the effects that a narcissistic pastor will have on people. We talk about the impact on the victims. We even engage in shame and blame online about these people, but I hear very little about how it happens to the leader, how he got this way, and what we can do to prevent it. And I think we should be thinking about this. So I put together a list of what I'm calling contributing factors that may lead to pastoral narcissism. And before I list these contributing factors, I want to note that I don't have any proven data to reinforce what I'm about to share. All I have is about 3 decades of experience in working with churches and pastors and people who sin. And I also have some experience with pastors who have had some narcissistic tendencies. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to share my intuitive response to the before mentioned 5 characteristics of a narcissist and what I believe are contributing factors to these sins. That's it. Contributing factor number 1. These leaders are gifted, and sometimes so gifted, they come to believe that they're better than everyone else. You know, most of the narcissistic pastors I know are gifted. They have gifts, talents, and abilities that are extraordinary. Thus, over time, they come to genuinely believe that they're better and more gifted than anybody else. And to add fuel to the flame, audiences love them and reinforce how gifted they are, which creates fanaticism around them that almost makes them impenetrable to the idea that they could be less than gifted. Contributing factor number 2. They are remarkable leaders, but fail to learn how to submit to authority. You know, some leaders, unfortunately, have never learned how to submit. Some leaders have never learned how to follow. I have even met some who refuse to follow because they believe they're so called to lead they can't follow. And for them, this call exempts them from followership. They believe it's actually beneath them to follow. But that is in direct opposition to what we understand about our faith. You see, being a follower of Christ is not a call to lead, it's a call to give up everything, both bad and good, to follow. And follower, which by the way is our title, assumes by definition that we submit to God's authority. And some leaders have never learned how to submit to authority. Keep in mind, submission to authority is a learned process. Here's what I mean. We do not have to learn how to reject authority. This is built into our sinful nature. We reject authority from our first breath. On the other hand, we do have to learn how to submit. And this is often a hard-learned lesson, one some leaders have never learned. Contributing factor number 3, I think we're at now 3. They are remarkable before an audience, but have never been successful in reconciling personal relationships. Simply put, they have unreconciled issues, whatever they may be, which have been left unaddressed. Some do not see the need to address them, of course, and thus they have never discovered the process and the power of personal reconciliation or restoration. This leads to the fourth factor, contributing factor number 4. They have trouble forming genuine connections with people and don't like to be troubled with other people's issues. These leaders just don't connect with other people on a deep level. They have a lot of superficial level connections, but perceive anything more to be a waste of their time. That is, unless they see some personal advantage in having a relationship with a person, and an advantage would include things like money, influence, power, or an expansion of their vision. And finally, contributing factor number 5. They love to provide feedback even when delivered poorly, and receive feedback poorly even when provided perfectly. You know, these leaders love to dish out feedback, but receiving it is a different story. Even when delivered perfectly and on point, they will interpret feedback as a criticism of who they are. Over time, they will end up dismissing the people who give it too frequently, and they may go on a counterattack, canceling their critics and building a case against them behind their back. Now, those are your 5 contributing factors. And again, this list I have just given you is very intuitive and it's not scientific. I'm going to admit that. But while I was thinking about these contributing factors, there's one thing I did learn. It's that just one of these factors can actually lead to devious sin. So now can you imagine how insidious this becomes when these factors begin to stack one upon another, and how a very gifted leader of people might use what they know to persuade and control other people? But here's the question I really want to address. It's, how do we prevent it? I mean, how can we prevent this, right? So this is where I spent most of my time in contemplation, mainly because this issue affects the church and people and victims and pastors and our witness to the world. And sometimes I think we're too reactive when it comes to issues of sin. I believe we need to find more proactive ways to address these issues, right? And I think for pastors to finish well, we need to be more proactive with narcissism that's on the rise in the church. So here are 2 potential preventative measures I think we can put into place. Preventative measure number 1. We need to ensure that leadership is open to discussing their personal sin. You know, I meet very few church leaders who feel free to discuss their sins openly. Most church leaders are apprehensive at best to share personal sin because it's threatening to them, their family, the church, their leadership, and ultimately their job. And there are some sins that, if revealed, would disqualify a pastor from pastoral leadership. But hiding these sins doesn't make the leader better. It might, however, actually contribute to the development of narcissism. What we need to do is help leaders speak openly about their sins, mainly because, well, everyone sins. And I believe we could create an atmosphere that gives leaders the freedom to discuss their sins. Then we might have an opportunity to address these sins when they're lesser sins, which might prevent them from growing into greater sins. Keep in mind, narcissism in a pastor's leadership was a tiny issue at one point. It started with a small sin and then grew into something more devious over a prolonged period of time. Take, for example, Rabbi Zacharias. He didn't just all of a sudden one day solicit women at a massage business, right? Instead, it started with one moment, a back problem that needed a massage, and then it grew into more. You know, the writer John Owen once said, "You got to be killing sin or sin will be killing you." And Owen is spot on. He means that we can't be passive to sin, because sin is not passive. Sin and the enemy are always actively seeking to devour leaders. And one of the ways that we can be active and even proactive rather than reactive to sin is by learning to be more open about our sin. And in the Bible, this activity is actually called confession. Confession is agreeing with God about what he already knows. It's saying something to God about ourselves that he knows to be accurate, but we need to say so that he knows that we know. But guess what? You can't hide anything from God. You know, as a pastor myself, one of the indicators I look for in other pastors is a genuine understanding of their sin. I look for their willingness to talk about it and to confess it openly. And I believe this must come out in their preaching. And not just in their preaching to illustrate a point or to elicit a laugh, but to reveal their need for God's grace as a believer. Leaders that know how to do this in the right spirit and the right way, I think, are exceptional pastoral leaders. Just take the Apostle Paul. He always addressed his sin in his teaching, even sin he wanted to remove but couldn't, and how this battle was exhausting for him, right? Besides, by sharing our sin, we expose ourselves and our own need for grace, which is exactly what our people need. They need deliverance from their sin as well and an understanding of God's grace. And it puts us on the same playing field, which you are already on. Preventative measure number 2 is this. We can prevent this issue by ensuring the leadership takes proactive steps to address their pattern of sin. So I've said it already, everybody sins. And because everybody sins, we should expect to battle with sin. And the people who should be the most proactive in their battle with sin should be our spiritual leaders. And one of the proactive steps I think spiritual leaders can take, really anybody can take, is actionable steps to avoid this sin that's common to them. One example is the Billy Graham rule. You may have heard of it. This is the practice among some male leaders in which they avoid spending time alone with women with whom they're not married. It was a rule adopted by Graham to avoid sexual temptation and was later named after him. Now, I know some people protest this rule for a variety of reasons, but I don't. I see validity in it. It's a preventative measure for a specific type of person with a particular kind of sin challenge. And I believe proactive measures like this for leaders that help one take actionable steps against sins that are common to them are helpful, only as long as they do not cause it to become a form of works-based legalism. You see, proactive measures can be beneficial to guide us away from repetitive sin issues, but this is not to suggest that every leader needs the same proactive measures or that we should legislate blanket measures for everyone on a staff team. I think that was tried years ago and became a system of Pharisaical legalism that Jesus eventually rejected, called the oral law. Now, I do think we would see more pastors finishing well if they could do a few things here. First, articulate the pattern of sin that's common to them. Second, develop actionable preventative strategies for this pattern of sin. And third, demonstrate how they have matured through that sin over time. Let me illustrate. It was about 8 years ago when I met up with a senior leader at a very well-known ministry. He shared with me a weekly accountability report that every leader on the staff team was required to complete. It was a 2-page report on personal sin. Not job duties, personal sin. So just for fun, I completed the worksheet for about 6 months on my own. I didn't share with anybody that I was completing it. And after a while, I will confess that it got a little repetitive and predictable, so I quit doing it. But I did learn something beneficial. By weekly addressing my sin, I got a lot more familiar with my pattern of sin. After only weeks of completing it, I got tired of seeing certain things on the report. So I developed some new strategies. And at about the 6-month mark, I learned to talk about my sin issues in a new way. And in the end, this tiny bit of self-regulation, which was proactive, helped me to take some proactive steps against my sin in my life. So in the end, I think that I learned that pastoral narcissism is just a massive sin issue, one that has matured and gone unaddressed. And my conclusion is this: pastors get this way because our churches have become too passive to sin. We have let sin creep into the doors of the church. We have lowered the bars of our stance on sin. We as individuals in a community of faith have become too passive to our sin. And as a result, our passivity is actually inviting it in. But this can all change with one word. One word can bring about the most monumental change in a church. It can heal wounds, redeem people, restore churches. And it's the first word Jesus ever preached. Do you know what it is? Repent. Thanks for being with me. Hope you enjoyed it. If you have, share it with someone you know. I'll see you right back here again next time.